good manners. People said, excuse me, sorry, ladies first, age first. Anybody here, any of you remember when good taste was the rule, the norm in our society? You remember when you could turn your television on and with the kids around and you weren't afraid you would get embarrassed by something that was said or something that was seen? You remember when you could go to a restaurant and you could relax in a restaurant without being bombarded with four-letter words from the table close by? You remember when movies left something, anything, to the imagination? I'm getting old. And I realize that. But I think all of you understand what I'm talking about, even Joey. Any of you remember Al Cap, who was the creator of the comic strip Little Abner? Al Cap was once invited to a university to give a lecture to the students. Before he could begin speaking to the large group that had assembled in the auditorium, a very unkempt-looking student back in the back of the room shouted a vulgar word at him. The word just, rang in everybody's ears, and there was a shocked silence, but Cap, keeping his composure, said, "Well, now you've given us your name, what's your question?" I want to come back to that a little bit later. Now that you've given us your name, what's your question? Jesus is in one of his familiar controversies with the Pharisees. It seems like every time we read something about Jesus, there's a controversy. Isn't that amazing? That everywhere he went, the Prince of Peace, the King of Kings, the Son of God, there were controversies. Here he is in another one. He's in a controversy again with the Pharisees. The Pharisees had certain rules. Now, we think maybe, that these were rules of hygiene. Don't eat till you wash your hands. But that's not what it was. These were religious rules. I'm sure at some point in the past, that was a hygiene rule. Don't eat till you've washed your hands. I shared with some earlier that my youngest granddaughter and a friend of hers, three others, went to Six Flags yesterday, came home late last night, about midnight, they were all sick. Sherry shared the same thing from eating somewhere. And I'm sure, you go in a place and it says employees must wash hands before returning to work. I'm sure it was that, but the Pharisees had made it a religious thing. And Jesus is trying to get them to change their focus to matters of greater importance. In verses 10 and 11, he calls the crowd to him and he said, "Listen and understand. What goes into the mouth does not make a person unclean, but what comes out of the mouth is what makes that person unclean." Now, I editorialize that a little bit because I think it's saying the scripture says him and man, but it applies to both. And then he begins to explain this further in verses 19 and 20, because out of the heart come evil thoughts. Out of the heart comes murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander, and this is what makes a person unclean. But eating with unwashed hands doesn't make a person unclean. It might make you sick, but it don't make you unclean. And if I'm understanding Jesus correctly, what he's saying here is that what comes out of our mouth is a reflection of what's in our heart. So when Al Cap said to the young man with the filthy mouth, "Now that you've given us your name, what's your question?" I think Al Cap was speaking the truth. The young man had stated what he really was on the inside by the quality of his speech. truth and not trash. As the star of Wayne's World said to his co-host Garth some years ago when that was popular, when Garth used profanity, he said to him, "You kiss your mother with that mouth?" For that. Just think for a few moments. Let's talk for a few moments about clean hands and dirty hearts. Jesus wasn't knocking clean hands. He wasn't saying, go eat with dirty hands. That's not what he's saying at all. He's not saying, well, no, you don't have to wash your hands. Just don't matter what you've had your hand in. Well, that's not what he was saying. He was just concerned that the Pharisees' priorities got all messed up. They had become spiritual nitpickers. They were dealing with issues of minor consequences and ignoring critical issues. They were worried about people eating with unclean hands, but they were not worried about people who didn't have anything to eat. Donald Ray Barnhouse was a well-known British pastor writing some 85 or some 90 years ago, told about conducting a Bible conference at Montrose, Pennsylvania, for about 200 young people and a few older people in the crowd. He said on one of those days, two older ladies came to him and complained that some of the girls were not wearing stockings. And these two ladies wanted Dr. Barnhouse to rebuke these young people. Dr. Barnhouse looked the two women straight in the eye and said, "The Virgin Mary never wore stockings." Really? She didn't. It reminds me of a time years ago, I went to a church picnic and I didn't wear socks. And one of the ladies in the church just thought that was terrible, that I didn't wear socks to a church picnic. I didn't think about telling her that Jesus didn't wear socks. But he said in Mary's time, stockings were not known. So far as we know, they were first worn by prostitutes in Italy in the 15th century when the Renaissance began. Later, a lady of nobility scandalized the people by wearing stockings at a court ball, and before long, everybody in the upper class was wearing stockings, and by Queen Victoria's time, stockings had become the badge of the Victorian prude. He said these ladies were struck by the forcefulness of my argument, and they had no more to say. He goes on to say, "I did not rebuke the girls for not wearing the stockings, and a year or two afterward, most of the girls in the United States were going without stockings in the summer, and nobody thought anything about it." Nor do I believe that this led toward the disintegration of moral standards in the United States. Time for changing and the step away from Victorian legalism was all for the better. It's amazing how hung up some people can get over relatively minor issues. Things that don't mean anything in the great scheme of things. But if you're a legalist, now see if you can follow me here. If you're a legalist, then there are no minor issues. But if that's so, that there are no minor issues, then there are no major issues either. And if there are no major or minor issues, then long-haired man becomes the spiritual equivalent of murder. And the length of a skirt becomes comparable to adultery. The legalism, you see, continually strains at the gnat while swallowing the camel. Jesus undoubtedly appreciated many things about the Pharisees, but their sense of priorities was all messed up. We need to remember that Jesus was a practicing Jew. And some people go, "Oh, yeah, Jesus was a Jew, a practicing Jew. He kept many of the traditions of his people. Each Sabbath he was in the synagogue. Even if he didn't agree with the speaker or the preacher, he was there. Even if he, above all others, knew that his fellow worshipers were hypocrites, he was there. Even though there was nothing more that he could learn about God, he was there. He was a part of the fellowship of believers. He said on one occasion that he had come to fulfill the law, not to destroy the law. There was a whole lot that the Pharisees did, a whole lot about the Pharisees that Jesus agreed with. But he would not put up with people who patted themselves on the back for keeping the little intricacies of the law, while at the same time they were ignoring the hurts of people around them. Even more important is that the Pharisees were building walls that excluded people who needed God's help. And this is the tragedy in their misplaced priorities. While they were observing all the niceties of their religion, they were making some of their neighbors feel like dirt. And Jesus came to build bridges between people and not walls. Jesus didn't come to put up any walls. A writer named Josephine Dedford Terrell tells an old story entitled The Golden Chain. It's about a college co-ed named Phyllis. During the first week of her sophomore year, Phyllis received an anonymous letter inviting her to join a secret sorority. The letter challenged Phyllis to do two things: to memorize the sorority's memory verse, excuse me, and then to befriend 10 freshman students before the week was out. The memory verse read this way: I expect to pass through this life but once. If therefore there be any kindness I can show, or any good thing I can do to any fellow being, let me do it now, and not defer or neglect it, as I shall not pass this way again. Over the next few weeks, Phyllis received more letters from the secret sorority. Every time the letters came, they reminded her to befriend more freshman students. And also, one of the letters disclosed the sorority motto. The motto was, kindness is the golden chain by which society is held together. And Phyllis discovered that as she befriended these new students, she gained self-esteem. Until finally the day came for the meeting of the new secret sorority. And imagine Phyllis's surprise when she discovered that every woman in the sophomore class had been invited to be a member. Was. One of their professors, concerned by the rates of loneliness and depression among the freshmen, had conceived of the idea of a secret sorority of women who would become friends and mentors to the new students, and had instituted. Her experiment was a great success. Its influence stayed with those students long after they graduated from college. The Pharisees, rather than being a unifying force in society, have become a divisive force. Rather than being inclusive, they have become exclusive. Rather than raising the self-esteem of the people around them, they have made the people around them feel unworthy and unclean. You know, if we do that, we feel like it'll make us feel better if we can make somebody else, in our mind at least, beneath us. It elevates us. We feel like it does. It doesn't work, but we feel like it do. And that's what they're doing. It was not so much that their hearts were dirty, but they were cold and they were unfeeling. And what they didn't see was that God prefers bridges to walls. There's no doubt, no denying that the Jewish people owed a debt to the Pharisees. Much of what is the best in Judaism would have been lost without by the Pharisees. Sometimes I think we get on them too hard. Their insistence on keeping the traditions helped the Jews maintain their identity in a world filled with idols. They did this by setting themselves apart. They were the righteous ones in a world going to hell in a handbasket, as the expression goes. But they had gone too far. We can do that. We can go too far. They had built walls between themselves and others. Walls that couldn't be overcome. Walls that people couldn't get over. Walls that had no doors to go through. And Jesus wanted the disciples to build bridges, not walls. To reach out to people, not exclude people. It's a delicate situation that we're talking about here. You know, we go through it, and I'm sure you went through it. We went through it when our children were growing up, and now we're going through it again with grandchildren. We want to protect our children from the pitfalls of the adolescent years. Because we know that the kind of people that young people run around with sometimes determines their behavior. I know that for a fact. And I'm not putting the blame on somebody else, but I did a lot of things in my teenage years that I would not have done by myself. I did them with other people. Now, probably some of them were my idea, but not all of them were my idea. And I would not have done these things if it had been with a different group of people. But I've told you before, I wasn't raised in the church. I didn't go to church. I didn't belong to church. The people that I hung out with, well, they weren't either. But, so on the one hand, we know that God didn't mean for his people to wall themselves off from others, but on the other, we want our young people to be around other young people who will influence them in a positive way. And to stay away from people who will bring them down. But somebody has to be around those that would bring them down, because that's the only way they can change. But you have to be strong. It's a delicate balancing act. You know, we talk about it at home of the girls and who their friends are in school. And sometimes their mother will say, well, I wish she was so-and-so, or a friend with so-and-so, because so-and-so's grade, you know, is much better, and such and such don't care about the grades. And that kind of thing, you know. I guess what you hope for is that your child will be the one that influences rather than the one that's influenced. It's a delicate thing here. It's the same way the strictness of the Pharisees provided the Jews with a measure of protection from the idol worship of their neighbors. But they had gone too far. The primary focus of Jesus' ministry was inclusiveness, not exclusive. He wants us to treat all people as worthy, because he gave his life for all people, not just for us. Sometimes that's hard for us to grasp. But Jesus gave his life for that person that's too hungover to be in church this morning. But Jesus gave his life for that person who's in jail this morning for doing whatever. But he did. Storyteller Lee Pennington tells about a lesson he learned from an old woodcutter named Jim. In a small town he lived in, and everybody in the town knew Jim. One of the reasons they knew Jim was because he was the ugliest man in town. There were people who avoided Jim just because he was so ugly. But Lee considered Jim a friend, because Jim had taken Lee under his wing and taught him how to find and cut the best wood in the forest. And one day Jim challenged Lee. I never heard of this, and you know, if you think this is not right, you can tell me after the sermon. But Jim challenged Lee to go into the forest, go into the woods, and find two leaves from different types of trees that were the exact same shade of green. He said, gather as many leaves as you can, and if you can find any two from different trees that are the exact shade, same shade of green, I'll give you $10. Well, $10 was a fortune to a young man back then, so Leaf set about his task with vigor. He went into the woods, he collected as many different leaves as he could find, he brought them all back, and he laid all the leaves out before Jim, and then he realized that no two of them were a perfect match. And as he pondered the unique nature of each leaf, we understood that the same lesson could be applied to human beings too. At a young age, he learned to see the unique quality in every person he met. I think that's Christ's will for us. I don't think Christ wants us to major in minors. And I know that Christ doesn't want us to build walls. He wants us to build bridges. And all that really matters in our life is our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. And I know that he wants us to reach out to the people in the world for which Christ died. I know those things as sure as I'm standing here. We shouldn't major in minors. We shouldn't build walls. And that all that really matters is our relationship with God and with one another. And that we are called to share Christ's word. Not what goes in,